On the borders of the counties of Essex and Suffolk near Long Melford is the site of the most haunted house in England, Borley Rectory. Since it was built in 1863 by the Reverend H.D. Bull, it's been plagued with psychic happenings. And these events have been witnessed and experienced by more people than any other alleged haunted house anywhere in the world. The late Harry Price, a psychical researcher of some fame, undertook a painstaking and thorough investigation of Borley, witnessing many of the phenomena himself. This work is recorded in 2 of his books, The Most Haunted House in England and The End of Borley Rectory. As a haunted house, Borley Rectory had everything. It was a gaunt Victorian building which had been added to from time to time. Everyone who lived in the house, and literally hundreds of visitors, claimed that they felt, heard, or saw things which could not be explained by normal means. The catalogue of events is so varied it covers almost the entire field of psychic happenings. They include the movement and sometimes materialization and disappearance of objects, the ringing of bells, despite the fact the wires had eventually been cut, the opening and closing of locked doors, inexplicable noises, and curiously, odours, sometimes pleasant, sometimes decidedly unpleasant, like the smell of decaying corpses. Many people claim to have seen a phantom coach and horses near the house, and probably the most famous ghost of all is the Borley nun. Strangely enough, the destruction of the rectory was predicted in a séance, and in February 1939 the place was completely gutted by fire, which seemed to start spontaneously while the building was unoccupied. After the fire, Harry Price continued his investigation. He excavated the cellars, and here he unearthed part of the skull of a woman. Assuming that this belonged to the ghostly nun, he gave it a Christian burial at Liston churchyard, and it was assumed that peace would reign over the troubled site. But did it? Geoffrey Groom Hollingsworth and Roy Potter do not believe that this is the case, and since March 1970 they've been investigating both Borley Church, which is also alleged to be haunted, and the site of the rectory. They're dedicated, down-to-earth people who spent hours and hours on the project, often during freezing weather conditions. They've also gone out of their way to fill in the biographies of the people who originally lived there. They were particularly interested in the members of the Bull family, and their investigation showed that previous biographers had not been very accurate with their facts.
We decided the Bull family really had never really been delved into properly. When we say properly, various people have taken the Bull family and got dates completely wrong, names completely wrong. We decided, well, it would be well worth going into the history of the Bull family, because they featured so prominently at Borley regarding manifestations there. So, after travelling many hundreds of miles, viewing dozens of people, and by sheer fluke was bought a diary. So it was written by the eldest Bull girl, Caroline Sarah Elizabeth Bull. And of all the Bull girls, she was the only girl that married. And she wrote this diary when she was 21 years of age. And in 1885, the rectory was a very, very happy place. Although Papa in those days knew all about the nun and used to sit many hours in the summer house on the lawn. In fact, he erected it to watch the nun along the wall.
Coming back to Caroline,
yes,
is there any record of psychic happenings in the diary?
Yes, she had a very, 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 very strong influence over moving chairs. Mind you, everybody we have interviewed has said that the Bull family were not a strange family, they were a Victorian family, and what they said could be taken as absolute gospel truth. They weren't living in another world, they were down-to-earth people.
Today, the villagers are reticent to talk about the happenings at Borley, and this is quite understandable. The publicity which followed Harry Price's investigations drew crowds of tourists to the area. Unfortunately, some of these people misbehaved quite badly, causing damage to property and making life difficult for the residents. But the investigators did manage to gather some eyewitness reports. One man travelling home at night had a terrifying experience.
He was coming on his motorbike, and to his amazement, coming across the field, across the road, into the rectory grounds, a coach and horses with the coachman on, and he went right through it, actually. It was a terrible cold sensation.
But this experience was not unique, for during the last war, a soldier had an identical encounter.
Apparently he also was on a motorbike as a dispatch rider, and he didn't know anything at all about Borley. And he was coming up to Borley Church, up the hill, toward the rectory on the left and the church on the right, when, to his amazement, just the same thing happened again. He saw this coach and horses coming along across the field and passed right in front of him, because he went right through it too. He disclosed it to his wife, but he didn't like telling anybody else because he felt such an idiot. But then he did a bit of investigation. He asked one or two villagers in Borley, this was during wartime, and they said, oh yes, that's right, that's the coach and horses of Borley, and it's coming along the old river road.
Like many of the investigators before them, Potter and Groom Hollingsworth experienced a wealth of psychic events for which they have no rational explanation.
The first thing we ever did come across there were the footsteps on the road. Past where we were, we had the car parked, past the church gate. They got up to about in line with the church cottage, and then they ceased. We only got this twice, but it was definitely footsteps.
Recording the supernatural can be a costly business, particularly if the spirit at the other end of the microphone doesn't seem to want to be taped. An expensive tape recorder was set up in the porch of Borley Church and left running unattended. After some minutes, there was a loud crash in the porch. The two volunteers keeping watch on the church were so frightened they daren't go forward to see what had happened. Instead, they asked for help via their walkie-talkies.
By this time, I got in touch with Roy, and he came along. And he said, well, come on, we'll get straight down to the porch. And we went straight down the porch. And to our dismay and horror, on the porch floor, which is stone, worse luck for us, was our tape recorder, which was, it was pretty well battered. And all the tape had come off the reels. It was all over the place. And we could never really account what happened, because there certainly wasn't anybody knocking about.
Since the demolition of the rectory, an orchard has been planted on the site. But this doesn't seem to have removed the cause of the hauntings, for a wide variety of noises have been heard there, including raps, a panting dog, the sound of smashing crockery, and heavy furniture being moved about. And it was here that the investigators had a very odd experience indeed.
And here again, it was moonlight. The funny thing is that most times things have happened at Borley, there's been a full moon. This time we were in the garden of the bungalow. There's a small fence which runs along by the side of the bungalow, which separates the ground of the bungalow from where the rectory was. We were stood there, very, very quiet, and all of a sudden we heard this thudding in the rectory grounds. It was kind of thud, 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 and a most peculiar sound which we couldn't account for at all. And then we saw the fruit trees are growing actually where the rectory stood. The fruit trees, the branches of the fruit trees moved. And there was no wind at all. It was absolutely still. But the most remarkable thing of this was that something came to the fence, and it was an almighty thump. And that's the only time I've ever seen my colleague Roy here step back.
At first, we thought it might be some animal or wildlife that was moving about, so we threw stones in the vicinity of the sound in case it was an animal, hoping it would scurry away, but this didn't perturb it at all. It just carried on in the general direction towards the fence. And then, as it came towards the tree, this tree seemed to shake about a bit. So we looked down to see if anything was down there. We saw nothing, and then there was this great big bang on the fence, and that is when I stepped back, thinking, what is it, is something going to come over? Yet we saw nothing at all.
Another peculiar thing. Now, this wasn't full moon. It was misty. It was a very misty night. This was somewhere about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were all concentrating on the walk. When all of a sudden we heard voices, actually girls' voices and men's voices, and there was laughter and merriment. But somehow, we didn't think much of that. And in fact, one of the team said, oh God, there's somebody coming up the roadway at 3 o'clock in the morning. So with that, we went down towards the roadway, and there wasn't anybody about on the road whatsoever. And when I walked towards the hedge bordering the road, the voices seemed to be concentrating on the hedge, just like coming along. But this is the tragedy. This happened the week after we'd had that incident with the tape recorder in the church porch, and we hadn't got any tape recorder with us. And then these voices carried on. They were very clear. Very, very clear. So much so, Roy wasn't at all satisfied about this. He said there must be somebody down the road. So he got in his car and he coasted. I didn't put the engine on. He coasted down the hill. He stayed down there and got his walkie-talkie out and said, there's nobody down here whatsoever. There's nobody along the Long Melford Road. I quite believe this because it's 3 o'clock in the morning. We thought it might be somebody coming home from a dance. You know, we thought we would sound the travel plots from the Long Melford Road across the river, and that would be... Anyway, we weren't really satisfied with this. But we then tried, the following visit, we tried an experiment out. And this time, we got 2 of the team to go down on the Long Melford Road and to shout to see whether we could really hear them. But we couldn't hear them at all.
Another strange thing we had only once was the smell, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
It was very windy. It was about, 11 o'clock, wasn't it? 11 o'clock before midnight. And it was only confined to a 10-foot square. And you'd think that if you stepped out of this 10-foot area, with the wind blowing, you'd smell it. But you could corner this square off with 4 of us, and it was only in this particular square you could smell it.
Well, I was do that. What odor?
Now here is a description of the sighting of a ghost by these 2 men. This sighting lasted over 12 minutes. It was no mere fleeting impression, no imagination. This really happened. They actually saw the ghost of the Borley nun. Listen now as Geoffrey Groom Hollingsworth takes up the story.
I was stood in one corner of their garden, looking down towards where the nuns' walk started. The night was rather chilly, but I felt exceptionally cold, and I got a queer sensation. And I happened to look down to the corner, the opposite corner of the garden from where I was stood, and I saw this figure approach. I couldn't discern what it was properly. And then I could see it was definitely somebody with a cowl and habit. Well, I thought, now, it's somebody pulling my leg, and all of a sudden this figure seemed to glide across their garden. Well, I was still rather skeptical until it came to the fence and the hedge, which borders their garden, and then it went through there without making any noise whatsoever. So I thought, well, now, the nearest one I can call to here and get here as quick as possible would be Roy, who was on the road. So I contacted Roy. In the meantime, the figure turned round, came back again, crossed the garden, and disappeared through the garage that they have. And I thought, oh, good God, it's too late. He won't see anything, because that could probably be the finish. The figure then came out from the garage and came with about 12 feet off me. I was able to observe the figure properly, which was a nun in a habit, but the habit was grey. The face, from what I could see, wasn't of a young novice, as people previously said before. I would say a woman somewhere in the 60s. And Roy must have seen exactly the same thing, because he stopped absolutely dead. And then the nun went through the hedge again. He then came quietly and joined me, and we managed to climb over and follow her, keeping about 12 feet behind. And this was the most interesting point here, because when she had crossed this hedge, she then came across a ditch the owner of this rectory cottage had dug. There was no water in it. There was a plank, by the means you could get across. She went across there just as though the whole thing was filled in. Well, Roy and I managed to scramble over the plank that was there. We then kept her within sight of about 12 feet, and then she disappeared through a pile of bricks that this man had got in the back of the garden, all stacked up about 15 foot high. She disappeared through there, and that was the last I saw of her.
Were you frightened when you saw this ghost?
Well, no. Neither was a frightened. I will say this, that I'm not bragging about this, but I don't think there's anything to be afraid of in this. Because, well, in this instance, I didn't feel any kind of animosity or any... it was a sensation, very close sensation, but it was peaceful. It was tranquil. But Roy here isn't afraid of anything. I think he's less afraid than I am.
After listening to a description like that one, we had to admit we felt very skeptical about the whole thing. Were these men pulling our legs? Or did these things actually happen? The only way to get an answer was to join them on their next visit to Borley. We decided to arrive just before midnight, not because this is supposed to be a bewitching hour, but to offset the chance of other people being in the area who might disturb us. We selected the church for our first investigation, and before doing anything else, we searched the building thoroughly.
Well, we're just going into the vestry. No, there's nobody here. There's a cupboard. That's locked. There's certainly no human being in the church. We've searched. It's the car church now.
After this, we placed a cassette recorder by the altar, and then two of us took up station in a pew at the opposite end of the church and instructed the others to lock us in. It was an eerie experience, and there certainly were some odd sounds generated, including loud and small raps. During our vigil, we'd heard an odd sort of bump sound originating near the altar. This was picked up by the recorder at that end of the building, and was so strange we've repeated it 3 times for you to hear. So as to be absolutely certain that none of the team were in any way responsible for these sounds, we then locked 2 cassette machines into the church, one by the altar and the other at the opposite end of the building by the main door. And then we sealed the church and kept a watch around it for the next half an hour. It was during this period that the ghost decided to make its presence known, and to our utter astonishment, we recorded the sound of it opening a door, but a door which doesn't exist. It's interesting to note that the cassette machine placed by the main door picked up this sound as well, but at a much fainter level. And so we had a pretty good idea of where it had originated. It was obvious that the noise couldn't have come from the main door to the church, and so we immediately paid attention to the only other door in the building, the chancel door.
The noises that we picked up on the previous recording seem to have come from this door. It's got a curtain over it. The bolt doesn't look as though it's been moved. Now, can you try sliding that bolt back to see what sound it makes? It doesn't squeak.
By now, our opinion of the haunting had changed considerably, and the following week we returned to Borley Church to continue the investigation. We entered the building at about 12:30, but the atmosphere within seemed quite normal. So normal, in fact, that we remarked about it, and the first half hour's recording proved to be negative. For the second session, we set up a semi-professional stereo tape recorder with 2 high-quality microphones, one of which was placed near the altar and the other about halfway down the aisle in the center of the building. And in addition, a cassette machine was also set up by the altar. Having thoroughly searched the building, we started the machines running and locked them in. And as we did so, we felt a change in the atmosphere. One of the team said he felt as though he's being watched by somebody, and we all felt cold. This run proved to be very interesting, but after a few minutes, the microphone placed in the center of the church picked up a clatter, as though some object had been thrown down near it. For some reason which we cannot explain, a considerable amount of static seemed to be generated just before and during the sound. A few minutes later, the recorder began to pick up static again, and then there were the faint sounds of something moving about in the vicinity of the altar. The next sound was quite unexpected, and it sent a chill through our marrows. for the microphone in the centre of the church picked up quite clearly what obviously is a human sigh. This is so remarkable, we've repeated it 3 times at a slightly slower speed. The humming in the background is the fans of electric heaters warming the building. During the following session, the cassette recorder jammed completely, and somehow the tape was pulled out and strewn about all over the altar. It seemed as though this was an indication that our presence was resented, and as we feared that damage might occur to the tape machine, we packed it away and left a replacement cassette machine by the altar. This was not a top-quality product, and it tended to pick up the sound of its own motors running. Nevertheless, it recorded some very strange sounds. First of all, there was a sort of whirring noise. We thought that perhaps this sound might have been made by some animal. There didn't seem to be any other explanation for it. But the next one ruled that theory out. At about 3:45 in the morning, we recorded the sound of the door being opened again. Although this was similar to the previous one, it lacked the squeak of the bolt. After this, we decided to break the sequence of visits and to try again during the summer. Although we couldn't find any reason for the sounds, we wanted to check to see if the warm, dry conditions had any effect on the haunting. For security reasons, we kept the date of our visit a secret, and as an additional safeguard, we changed our minds a couple of times, finally setting off in July. It was a very dark evening, but warm enough for us not to have to wear top coats. We started recording at about 1 a.m., and the tapes revealed just the natural ambience of the building and nothing else. There was not a single click or rap audible. But as we entered the church at about 1:45, we all felt a change in the atmosphere. It's hard to describe the sensation. Some of us felt tingles running through our bodies. Others claimed they felt there was a presence in the building. We certainly felt that the next session would produce a result. And it did. It started with the sounds of movement somewhere near the altar. This was followed by the sound of a door shutting, but once again, a door which doesn't exist. After this, there was about 10 minutes silence, when only the natural ambience of the building and the cassette recorder motor could be heard. And then there was a crash, as though something had been knocked over. Then we became aware of an increase in the background noise on the tape, and another strange sound occurred. It ended with a kind of pop. This was followed by a much louder pop or explosion. We've amplified this and repeated it 3 times. The following sound occurred 10 minutes later, and it really sent shivers down our spines. It was the sort of effect one imagines haunted houses to produce. It originated just in front of the altar rail, and yet the floor there is of stone. If those were footsteps, they must have belonged to a very large and powerful man. 8 minutes later, there was another sound generated, but we have no idea what it represents. returned to the church the following August, and during the small hours of the morning, we all observed a glow around the chancel door, as though a phosphorescent aura were being generated. This night, the ghost made its presence known by producing some more sounds, which ended with a very frightening grunt or sigh. Listen as this sigh is repeated. For the fifth visit, we decided to man the church throughout the entire night. On previous occasions, we seemed to get the best results by leaving the equipment locked into the empty building. We'd thought that perhaps the human presence had some adverse effect on conditions. At about 4:30 in the morning, 3 of the team kept a vigil from the choir stalls adjacent to the altar, and this proved to be a memorable and frightening occasion. Once again, the church became cold, despite the fact it was a warm summer's night. There were numerous clicks and raps from the vicinity of the font, and at one time we heard a sound as though heavy timbers were being crushed, but in the darkness we couldn't see what was happening. Then we began to observe tiny points of light hovering in the curtain behind the font, and on one of the pews about a quarter of the way down the church. At first, we thought we couldn't believe our own eyes, and we broke the silence to speak about it.
I think that must be getting tired of that. I keep seeing things. Jerry, are you watching Peter, the curtain light? That's where I'm seeing them. That's why the lights up there. They walked up in the curtain. Okay? On the right-hand side, right in the curtain. They're tiny specks, aren't they? They're like, as you say, they're all like fireflies. Was it that? Yeah. Very curious, isn't it? Yeah. This is one of the pew again, then. Yeah. No, you're not seeing things, Peter. The 3 of us can see them, so it obviously exists, whatever it is. It's a strange phenomena. Yeah, just like little white points of light flashing. It was my eyes going funny.
After a while, the lights began to approach us, and we all felt apprehensive. We were locked into the building, and we knew that there were no other human beings inside with us. As we watched the lights, they changed into long strips, and then something threw an object at us. It's a strip this time, isn't it? It's a strip. Now, that was fantastic. We've no idea what that was. It certainly made all of us jump. It's curious that that seems to have been tied up, but you're getting colder and colder. It's like a build-up of power. It's very cold. The church sounds very cold indeed. My head's gone quite cold now. Also, I think if I had hair up there, it would be standing on end. Immediately after this, we conducted yet another painstaking and thorough search of the church, but we could find nothing to account for the incident. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that whatever produced those sounds was trying to communicate directly with us, although it might be argued that the throwing of that object and the violent attack on the tape recorder left in the porch indicate that perhaps somebody or something resents the presence of investigators. Perhaps we shall never know the answer. But one thing is certain, that despite exorcism attempts, seances, and the burial of that skull fragment, something remains. And although the rectory is no longer there, the surrounding area can still be called the most haunted site in England.